Welcome a goodly gang of people to come and hear Ian Kearns, who I think probably hardly needs introduction in the present company, but let me just remind you of a few important things about him. He's the co-founder and director of the European Leadership Network. And before that, he was the acting director and deputy director of the Institute for Public Policy Research in the UK, and deputy chair of the IPPR's Independent All-Party Commission on National Security in the 21st century, serving under co-chairs Lord George Robertson and Lord Paddy Ashdown. And in 2013, he co-edited Influencing Tomorrow, Future Challenges for British Foreign Policy, with Douglas Alexander MP, the then Shadow Foreign Secretary. And he also served as, in 2010, as a special advisor to the Joint House of Commons and House of Lords Committee on National Security Strategy. So you would hardly have somebody who's better qualified to talk on the theme of Western responses to Russian activities in the Ukraine. I'm really looking forward to hearing him.
Okay if I'm standing, if I want to be on candid camera, or do I want to sit, or... That's fine. Seriously, do you have a preference?
No.
I'm going to sit. It's been a long day. Let me start out by saying that actually no, I'm going to stand. Sorry, I'm just testing the camera. Let me start out by saying that I was very pleased to be asked and given the opportunity to do this talk, because not only because of some of the people here in this room and the people engaged in Pugwash and all of the great work that it does now and has done over many years, but also since we set up the European Leadership Network, initially with a focus entirely on nuclear weapons and still very heavily focused on nuclear weapons and nuclear dangers. Since we set up the ELN, of course, Europe has descended into its worst security crisis for 25 years. And it became very clear to us very quickly that if we were interested in trying to remove nuclear weapons from the security context in Europe, that those weapons were a function of the West, a function of the dysfunctional relationship between the West and Russia, and that if we didn't broaden our scope and address that wider relationship challenge, we were never going to get at the root cause, certainly in the European theatre, of why nuclear weapons were still part of the security environment. So we broadened our context and focus, and as a result of that, we now have two initiatives ongoing which I personally am very excited about and which are relevant to this agenda. One is a task force on cooperation in Greater Europe, and that's a task force made up of senior Russian political and military leaders, as well as former ministers, senior political leaders from elsewhere in Europe. And that task force is what you might describe as a sort of counter-cyclical task force, in that just as the continent has sunk into the security crisis, this is a group of people who are articulating the message that the West and Russia needs to work together more closely. We need to overcome our divisions, build on areas of common interest, and try and deepen our cooperation. Some of the personnel, you can find information about that task force on our website. It also has Ukrainian participation, which makes it interesting. Some of the personalities involved are people like former Russian Foreign Minister Igor Ivanov, Mikhail Margalov, the former chair of the Federation Council, a whole range of others, about 9 Russian figures. From the UK, people like Des Brown, we have Lazio, the former Spanish Foreign Minister, and so on. So we have this high-level conversation going on, which we think is important, particularly because so much of the formal channels of communication closed down. The other thing we have going on is an emerging leaders network, and just last week I was in Riga in Latvia, meeting with a group of emerging Russian leaders, emerging Ukrainian leaders, and emerging leaders from the rest of Europe and some from the United States. These are people that we hope might be in leadership positions in 7 or 8 years from now. And we were able to get Ukrainians and Russians in the room actually for the second time in the last 4 months, and to move the conversation beyond the the expression of very understandable emotion and anger about what's been going on in Ukraine, and move the conversation into a space of more constructive dialogue, and even to get commitments from the participants that they would stick with the process of engagement with each other, and to begin to develop some specific position papers that they can put into the public domain as emerging leaders about how we might move the situation forward. So for me, in my day job, I'm focused heavily on this issue of the Western relationship with Russia, the challenge of what's happening in Ukraine and its implications for our security environment, including for the issue of nuclear weapons. And I'll say something more about that in a moment. My first substantive point, I think, just is in terms of an overview of how one might address this challenge, is to say this. I mean, one could say, I think, that Western policy towards Russia over the last 25 years, and I would say this has been misguided in many respects. Personally, I don't believe that NATO should have enlarged to the east. I also, and I've written more recently, that the European Union strategy towards the Eastern Partnership countries was pretty much a walking disaster, and stimulated a geopolitical confrontation with Russia that we didn't need to have, or at least contributed to it. Having said that, and I'm just kind of tabling this up front, because for the next for part of the next 30 minutes, 35 minutes that I'm speaking, I think I'll probably sound quite hawkish, so, and perhaps engaged in what might sound like a little bit of Russia bashing. So I wanted to get those points of view on the table straight away. You know, I'm not somebody who thinks this is all about the Russians getting things wrong and the West bears no share of the blame. But having said that, what President Putin has done in the last year is violated borders in Europe, used force to annex Crimea, and I think he's mounted a quite substantial challenge to the post-Cold War security order, and all of the Helsinki principles which were at the heart of that security order, not least of which was that we don't deal with security challenges by using force against each other. And he has a very substantial, I think, responsibility to bear in relation to what's gone on. I'll come to the issue of how I think the West can and should respond to what President Putin said in a few minutes, but first of all I just want to say a few things about where we are. Obviously there's a conflict going on in Ukraine. It's been somewhat tampered down in recent weeks because of a ceasefire, but it's a very tenuous ceasefire, and every day there are reports of its violation. Nonetheless, we have about 5.2 million people in Ukraine living in a conflict zone today. We have about 1.6 million people who have been displaced by the conflict. About 950,000, a million of those are inside other parts of Ukraine, described as internally displaced people. Another 600,000 or so are in the bordering countries around Ukraine. A very substantial number of that 600,000 are in Russia. We've seen at least 6,000 deaths, although nobody believes the figure is as low as that, and an estimated 13 or 14,000 other casualties. And we've also seen, in the context of this conflict, the Ukrainian economy pretty much collapse. I mean, it's functioning, but it's close to collapse. And the Ukrainian average income in Ukraine today is just $4 a day. And in the context of all that, we have a raging debate going on about how Western institutions, the International Monetary Fund, the European Union, all of our governments can contribute to some sort of economic reform program in Ukraine. The amounts of money that are flowing in are not large enough to deal with the scale of the challenge in Ukraine, and there's a very real prospect still of a political and economic collapse in Ukraine. And we could end up with having a failed state of a population of over 40 million right in the heart of Europe on our hands. And on top of all of that, Ukraine faces just massive reform and anti-corruption challenges. So we've got a very significant challenge. The violence in Ukraine is not on anything like the scale it is in, say, Syria, and the casualties are not on the same scale, but for Europeans, this is by far and away, I think, the gravest security challenge we've faced for at least 2.5 decades. It's the deaths have not been yet on the scale of the collapse of Yugoslavia and the fragmentation of Yugoslavia, but because of Ukraine's position, because of its capacity to perhaps stimulate a Russia-West confrontation, strategically one could say it's more important. Now, all of that picture in relation to Ukraine is important and is worrying enough, but it's not, I think we can't take that in isolation. There's a whole wider context in terms of Euro-Atlantic security here, which we have to keep in mind. Let me just illustrate with some examples. On the 3rd of March last year, just over a year ago, a Scandinavian Airlines flight from Copenhagen en route to Rome with 134 passengers on board narrowly avoided a mid-air collision with a Russian warplane that was flying in civilian air corridors with its transponders switched off. That incident, the collision was only avoided because of action taken by the pilots of the civilian airline. This wasn't the only incident. There was another incident in December last year, very similar incident, again with a plane flying out of Copenhagen. The reason Copenhagen and that general territory is because the whole Baltic area, the Baltic Sea, the North Sea is becoming incredibly militarized. And we have, the potential for something very bad to happen in one of those kinds of incidents. Beyond that, there have been all kinds of other worrying developments in wider Euro-Atlantic security. In recent weeks, Russian warplanes have used NATO warships in the Black Sea as target practice. Repeated attack runs over NATO warships. We think to gather electronic intelligence about how the warships are preparing themselves to defend. But nonetheless, they're flying low, they're flying fast, and they're doing it in attack formation over NATO warships. And they're relying on NATO commanders to keep their cool and not do anything stupid and not assume that they're about to be attacked and not take a stupid or unfortunate decision. There have been, over the last 12 months, also simulated cruise missile attacks by Russian warplanes on a political festival where the Danish political leadership was gathered. Simulated cruise missile attacks on the United States. The abduction of an Estonian intelligence officer on Estonian and therefore NATO territory. An incident which involved the use of communications jamming, stun grenades and light weapons. Several incidents of intensive searches for Russian submarines, either in foreign country waters or in international waters near to nuclear bases, our own nuclear base, for example. And just so I don't sound like it's entirely Russian bashing, let me say that the Russian ambassador to NATO has also formally lodged complaints over what he estimates and the Russian authorities estimate to be almost 3,000 NATO aircraft flights very close to Russia's borders in what Russia is saying it considers to be hostile activity. And also the accusation that NATO warplanes themselves have been flying with transponders switched off. And I have to say that journalists like Julian Borgia at The Guardian and others have been trying to find out whether this is true or not, and we're still digging in terms of whether NATO is flying its warplanes around crowded European airspace with transponders switched off. The signs that we should be concerned about the general situation also go beyond there. Both Russia and the West and NATO are increasing the frequency and intensity of their military exercises close to each other. Our forces are coming up close and on a larger scale than they have done for a very long time. A vicious war of words is being played out between Moscow and Washington over precisely what happened in Ukraine. The Russian narrative is that the Americans essentially stimulated and backed an unconstitutional coup and removed the democratically elected government from power in Ukraine. And of course, the US narrative has been that Russia has deliberately stimulated a conflict in eastern Ukraine and has armed fighters taking part in that fighting from the separatist side. Intelligence sources at NATO and elsewhere tell us that it's not a case of individual Russians going into Ukraine in very small amounts of weapons, but they have evidence of whole formations of the Russian military going into Ukraine in formation and fighting in formation as integrated units. And that's precisely what happened last summer when for a time it looked like the Ukrainians were about to win the conflict and actually defeat the rebels in the east. There was then an influx of organised Russian forces that reversed the trend of that activity on the battlefield and made it clear to the Ukrainian government that they were not going to be allowed to win a military victory. We've had post-war treaties, post-Cold War treaties, which were designed to make the environment in Europe much more secure, like the Conventional Forces on Europe Treaty, a treaty that's supposed to give all sides transparency over where their conventional forces are, so that nobody's worried about a kind of short warning surprise attack. Those treaties have now fallen by the wayside or been withdrawn from. They're not operating. We have a live debate going on in the United States about whether the United States should provide weapons to the Ukrainian authorities, a decision which, if it were taken, would explicitly turn the Ukrainian conflict into a proxy war between Russia and the West. And one could go on. President Putin has been flexing his nuclear muscles, let's say. He's been he openly, in a documentary broadcast on Russian television just a few weeks ago, talked about the fact that he had put Russia's nuclear forces on alert during the time of the Crimea operations. It's widely thought that Russia has put nuclear weapons into Kaliningrad on the Polish border. And on a number of occasions, he's referred to Russia's nuclear weapons in a fashion which indicates that he'd like to remind people in the West that Russia is a nuclear-armed power and therefore can't be pushed around. So that's part of the context in which we're meeting in this room tonight. Other countries close to Russia are doing things that you would have hoped were a part of our European past. Lithuania, for example, has reintroduced conscription. Poland is considering is actively exploring the idea of turning various gun clubs around Poland into the makings of a home guard type military force. So there's a sense in which nobody wants war, nobody's predicting war, but people are nevertheless at a variety of levels doing things which indicate that they're getting a little bit more ready for war. At the same time, as we all know, economic sanctions have been applied to Russia. The economic relationship between Russia and the West is beginning to disintegrate. Of course, the Russian economy is suffering the most from that, but there are also significant economic impacts in Western European countries that trade heavily with Russia. People-to-people movement between Russia and the West and vice versa is declining. And all of the significant diplomatic channels that you would want open and functioning in the context of this crisis are being closed down. So things like the NATO-Russia Council has effectively been shut down. European Union Russia summits have been suspended. If you talk to bureaucrats in the US State Department or in the European Union or even in Moscow, if you talk to mid-level bureaucrats, they'll tell you, oh no, we're talking to each other all the time, but they're talking to each other in a political vacuum and with no authority to talk to each other about anything substantive or to negotiate anything. And this, in a sense, is gesture politics. Our leaders are looking for ways of demonstrating disapproval with each other, and what they're doing is closing down the channels of diplomatic engagement that they ought to be using to try and attack the underlying causes of this problem. Now, that's where we are. In terms of how the West should respond, and this is a personal interpretation of what we should do, but I'll structure this part of my comment into three areas. I think to deal with what I do believe is a direct challenge to the post-Cold War order in Europe from President Putin, I think there needs to be a certain level of resolve in the Western response. And I'll talk through some of what I think the elements of that resolve should be. A second theme, I think, in the Western response needs to be restraint. I mean, we are at the end of the day here talking about a potential confrontation between a nuclear-armed state on one hand and a nuclear-armed alliance on the other. The risks of escalation, unintended or otherwise, are significant. And there has to be some limits placed on the resolve that we show. And we have to, at the same time as trying to demonstrate resolve, we have to try and build in mechanisms for de-escalation and limiting the extent to which things can get out of hand. And then the third theme that I'll touch on is the theme of dialogue and the areas in which I think we should still be pursuing dialogue with Russia as part of an integrated response to this situation. With regard to resolve then, I think the first thing is, I mean, NATO countries just have to be very explicit with the Russian leadership about NATO territory being sacrosanct. I mean, one of the worrying things about this situation, actually more worrying than the mature phases of the Cold War, is that it's ripe with potential for miscalculation. I mean, in the Cold War, we had established, by the end of the Cold War, there were established patterns of behaviour, there were established expectations. People, however much we disliked it, people kind of knew that that was your space, and you know, we don't mess with you there, and vice versa. All of those things are not there now. There's a kind of grey area between the borders of NATO and the EU and Russia, the rules of engagement in which are not very clear. So I think the first thing that has to happen is that with regard to NATO territory, it just has to be made very clear that NATO is sacrosanct, and that if President Putin were to attempt similar activities in NATO territory to the activities that he's been performing in Ukraine, then you know, that would meet with a military response. And I think the only thing we can do is try and make sure that he understands that reality so that he never takes the risk. That, I think, leads to an interesting discussion amongst security analysts about the difference between deterrence and defence. There are people, I said I was in Riga last week, there were people in Riga who were deeply worried about the fact that NATO is not in a position to defend the Baltic states if President Putin decides to send his military into that part of NATO. And actually, they're not the only ones. I mean, there are very senior NATO ambassadors just in the last few weeks have been saying privately, they've been asking the question rhetorically, can NATO defend the Baltic states? The answer is no. Now, having said that, for much of the Cold War, the West couldn't have defended West Berlin either. But the point was, we had sufficient force in West Berlin to create effectively a deterrence tripwire. And there's a strong, I think, argument to be made for exploring that idea again. You know, do we need to increase the level of military force in the Baltic states to make it clear that any Russian activity would very quickly come up against, frankly, an American military, which would mean that the Americans were involved in the conflict from day one. And then, irrespective of whether that force was too small to hold back a Russian advance, the idea is that the risks are so incalculable that the risk is never taken by the Russian leadership. So I think that's an element of resolve that needs to be discussed, debated, the idea of increasing the military force there in that part of NATO territory. There's ongoing preparations for what's known as a Spearhead Rapid Reaction Force in NATO, but the best estimates are that that's going to take a couple of years to put together. We don't even have in the NATO countries the trains to put heavy armour on trains and take them to that part of Europe. We no longer have that stuff. We don't have the heavy lift aircraft to move some of the heavy equipment we would need up there. We have, spent the last 25 years effectively assuming that we needed to design our militaries for what were called out-of-area operations to do things in other parts of the world. All of these things are now being rethought, but the best estimate is at least late 2017 before NATO is ready with a kind of Spearhead Rapid Reaction Force of about 5,000 troops. So, that work obviously needs to continue, but it's not necessarily going to be enough in the short term. We need to perhaps exercise hybrid warfare contingencies. Hybrid warfare is the label that's been given to Russian operations in eastern Ukraine. Combinations of information warfare, troops with no insignia, deniable intervention, providing arms to local communities, trying to stimulate groups of local discontents into groups that are willing to fight and be destabilising influences on the states in which they live. NATO and the European Union is quite badly prepared for this, but it's something that we need to get into. There have been some interesting developments recently. Some analysts in the Baltic states, national security analysts, have suddenly started writing about regional economic development, drawing on academic literature that shows a kind of potential for unequal economic development to lead to less loyalty to nation. They're worried about Russian minorities in the Baltic states who, frankly, are not having such a good time economically. Not so much because they're being persecuted, but because in a smaller country like Latvia, economic development is strongly concentrated around the capital Riga, and it's very outside Riga, it's very uneven economic development. So all of a sudden, national security analysts are thinking, we've got to address our social challenges, we've got to address our economic challenges, we've got to make sure that we are not ripe for exploitation by outside influences that might want to destabilise us. We also, I think, have to do something directly in relation to Ukraine. We can't just focus on NATO territory, we have to think about Ukraine. And there's a strong argument for all of us doing much more to help Ukraine reform itself and to become a successful, functioning state. I mean, in many ways, the Russian operations in eastern Ukraine were only successful, to the extent that they have been, because the Ukrainian state was so corrupt and so dysfunctional, and the security services there and the judicial system there wasn't functioning on behalf of its own citizens, and that was ripe for exploitation. All of us need to, I think, help Ukraine to reform itself. And the Finnish president at the Munich Security Conference said something important in relation to this, I think, including in relation to how Ukraine should try and defend itself. I mean, he effectively said to the Ukrainian president on the stage, if you turn yourself into a successful functioning state that is economically prosperous, democratic and socially just, a country that your citizens want to defend, if it comes under attack, then that is your strongest possible defence strategy for the future. And this was in the context in which everybody was arguing about whether the Americans should give weapons to the Ukrainian military. And he said that on the basis of some experience in Finland. And he explicitly referred to the Winter War back in the period of the Second World War and the fact that Finland mobilised 2 million citizens to defend the country. Now, ultimately, they weren't able to resist the Soviet Union entirely, but they did preserve their independence, and it took quite a long time for the Soviet forces to suppress their defence. So he was suggesting something to the Ukrainians about how they might defend themselves in this context, which I think is worth thinking about. But also the issue of reforming Ukraine and helping Ukraine to become prosperous, it seems to me, is one of the only ways in the long term it's likely that Crimea could ever become part of Ukraine again. And that is really through a mechanism in which you want the citizens of Crimea to look at the rest of Ukraine and think that is so successful that we want to be a part of that. And the same applies to eastern Ukraine as well. So there is, I think, nobody these days, even the authorities in Kiev, are not arguing for trying to prioritise taking Crimea back in any way. I think psychologically they make a strong distinction between Crimea and what's happening in the Donbass region in eastern Ukraine. But long term, what they require is that nobody recognises the legality of the annexation of Crimea, just in the same way that the annexation of the Baltic states by the Soviet Union was not recognised legally by the West, and that someday, at some stage in the future, perhaps Crimea will become part of Ukraine again. Those things have to be part of the Western response. So also, I think, does some Western help to Ukraine to defend itself. And here I make a strong distinction between the West providing lethal aid to the Ukrainian authorities and the West providing other things. I mean, NATO countries can provide command and control support to the Ukrainian authorities. They can provide intelligence and battlefield awareness support to the Ukrainian authorities. They can do things to help the Ukrainians train a professional officer corps, train troops in a professional way, make sure that the Ukrainian military is fully democratically accountable to the elected authorities in Kiev. We still have so-called volunteer battalions wandering about in the east of Ukraine under the control of certain oligarchs and not under the control of the Ukrainian government. We can help them, I think, with all of that, but not, I think, with providing the lethal aid. And I think one other thing the West needs to do is to make sure that NATO and the European Union are working together much more closely in terms of mounting a response. Because NATO does all of its military stuff, and everybody, the membership of these organisations are almost entirely the same. I know it's not completely the same, but you get all the same people going to meetings to talk about the military side of things in one organisation. You get them going then down the road in Brussels to another institution to talk about economic dimensions. And the two bureaucracies are not allowed to work together. They're not allowed to coordinate their activities together because the membership is not the same. We need to find a more effective way of getting them to work together, not least because on some of these hybrid warfare challenges, frankly, if you go to NATO and say, what are you going to do to stop President Putin doing something similar in the Baltic states with a hybrid warfare challenge to what he's doing in Ukraine, and they'll say, that's not a NATO problem. NATO is not the first responder. You need to go down the road and talk to the European Union. This is about governance support, it's about economic support, it's about judicial and security sector reform, all of those things. So there's something we need to do in relation to getting these Western institutions to work together more effectively. So I think if you put all those things together, there's a strategy which is sufficient in the sense of it shows some resolve. It shows that European countries don't intend to just accept what's going on. It shows that we understand that this kind of use in force in Europe has to be resisted. It shows, I would argue, that it's a constructive set of developments, even in its more robust elements, because I personally do not believe that we will have peace in Europe if we don't persuade President Putin that there are only so far that he can go. Because he is a leader, I think, who will take risks. And we've got to try and make sure he understands what the risks are and try and contain this conflict to some extent, partly through this kind of resolve. And we have to do it, I think, as I said earlier, because of the risks of escalation. Those risks might, I mean, escalation could be unintended. History is full of political leaders who mistakenly over-exaggerated their capacity to control events. And, you know, events sometimes develop a momentum of their own. So I think we have to try and ensure that we're being as clear as possible and we're showing that there will be some robust response to certain Russian behaviour. Having said that, we do have to balance resolve with restraint. And that restraint needs to be applied in a number of areas. So we may need to consider increasing sanctions against Russia. But I would argue there has to be some limits to how far sanctions go in relation to the Russian economy. It cannot be the goal of sanctions to destroy President Putin's regime or to collapse the Russian economy. Towards the end of last year, there was an interesting moment when lots of Western leaders were talking tough on sanctions on Russia, but one particular day, I think it was December 17th, the ruble collapsed, pretty much collapsed, and the alarm in Western capitals was pretty much instantaneous. And in that moment they signalled, actually, well, we want to inflict pain, but we don't want to inflict that much pain. And the dilemma is, if we persuade President Putin that we're trying to remove him, that's going to make him a far more dangerous political adversary. And he will do things because he thinks he has nothing to lose, and so will the people around him. And secondly, even if we did make the Russian economy collapse, we have no idea what would come next. And you can't find many serious Russia experts who will tell you that what would follow President Putin in that scenario would be a group of Western-leaning liberals who want to democratise and modernise the country. So, and the other thing to bear in mind is if you collapse the Russian economy, Russia will be a nuclear-armed failed state in Europe. And for anybody who's read the whole saga of the attempt to control Russian nuclear weapons and to make nuclear materials in Russia secure at the end of the Cold War when the Russian military collapsed, anybody who's read that story, I think, gets to the end of it and thinks, how did we get away with that? And I think to imagine, and even to design as an act of policy, try to reenact that whole scenario is a deeply flawed approach to policy. So sanctions have their role to play, but we can't overdo them. And I think in that sense, sanctions at the moment are being asked to play a role in our policy is too great and more than the strain that they should be asked to bear. Sanctions are not a strategy, are not a whole strategy. And so, you know, there are limits, and we have to show restraint in the application of sanctions. I think one can do certain things, perhaps targeted sanctions on technology transfer, which can hurt the development of the Russian economy long term. And for students of the Cold War, people will be aware that it was some of the technology transfer restrictions which really damaged Soviet capacity to develop the economy, and ultimately, one could argue, brought down the collapse of the Soviet system. Another way to approach sanctions is to say there will be no engagement at all on specific initiatives. So, for example, we're not going to engage in economic activity, investment, trade, or anything else with Crimea. You know, that we're just not going to do that to try and carry the political message. But that involves some restraint in general terms in the application of our sanctions. I said earlier that NATO should provide certain kinds of military assistance to Ukraine, but not lethal aid. We have to be restrained in the way that we do that. We do not want a direct proxy war between Russia and the West and Ukraine. But, not very much heard of in the Western debate, is that Ukraine has a large defence industry of its own. The huge debate that was taking place a couple of months ago about whether the United States should provide Javelin anti-tank missiles to Ukraine is in a sense now out of date because the Ukrainians have produced a missile which is nearly as good as the Javelin missile in their own defence industry. And in fact, last year Ukraine was even exporting weapons to other parts of the world. In fact, it was the 9th largest exporter of military equipment in the world. Some of it offensive, lethal weapons. So that has to be borne in mind. But there are also another 60 countries at least in the world who are categorised as major arms exports. Now, I haven't come to this group tonight to say what a great thing that lots of countries are exporting arms and that I'm a great believer in arms exports. But If we argue that Ukraine has to be allowed to defend itself, and if we're worried about the risk of a proxy war, and if we're worried about the potential for nuclear escalation, then the way to do this is to say to Ukraine, we will professionalize your military, we will help you with command and control, we will help you understand how to make your military democratically accountable, but you shouldn't be stopped from acquiring the arms you need to defend your country on the open market if that's the only thing, if that's the only way you can do it. We shouldn't get in their way of doing that if that's the only way they can defend their territory. I also say that because I do not believe that President Putin will allow the Ukrainian economy and society to be modernized if Ukraine is defenseless. I think if it's completely defenseless, then he will feel that he can destabilize Ukrainian reform anytime he wants by increasing the violence and other measures, which will mean, I think, that Ukraine just becomes a basket case and has no future. And as I said earlier, potentially a failed state itself. So I think there has to be an element of defence, but it does need to be carried out with restraint. We definitely need restraint in deployments of NATO forces in Eastern Europe. I said earlier that there was a potential argument for a kind of small deterrent tripwire force of the kind that used to exist in Berlin. But there are analysts now, many analysts, some of them important and influential analysts, arguing that NATO should be stationing nuclear weapons in the east of Europe. There's been a debate raging in some of the strategic journals in the last few months amongst people arguing that battlefield nuclear weapons should be put back into Eastern Europe. Some of the stuff that was the most terrifying of the Cold War. This is a direct response to President Putin putting his nuclear weapons in Kaliningrad and generally, engaging in nuclear saber-rattling. That would be a big mistake, in my opinion. We have to exercise restraint in that area as well. NATO could do something much simpler if it felt the situation was so bad that it needed to find a way of demonstrating to President Putin that NATO was also a nuclear-armed alliance. For example, we have aircraft in Europe that are trained to do both nuclear and conventional missions, and they could simply be exercised in Eastern Europe. They could conduct certain kinds of exercises in Eastern Europe just to signal that NATO has options, should they ever be called upon. But it's a sad fact that that's the sort of scenario that we're getting into, and that we're now having to fight arguments. I mean, I've spent, as some of you will know, I spent, let's say, the first half of the last 5 years arguing for the removal of the 200 NATO nuclear weapons that are still stationed, US nuclear weapons that are still stationed in Europe. I still believe that that's what NATO should do, and I still argue for it, but I'm now having to engage in arguments to stop people bringing extra nuclear weapons to Eastern Europe, not just to fight the argument we were fighting before this all started. So, but again, restraint has to be shown, and there are ways we can communicate the resolve without engaging in escalation. We also need restraint and sober judgment in our assessment of Russian capabilities. Lots of people are talking up the Russian military threat, and lots of people are talking up the strength of the Russian military because President Putin has invested large amounts of money in it in recent years. But there's lots of good intelligence and analysis to suggest that in order to do what they've done in Ukraine, the Russians have had to cannibalize a huge number of units of their military, even taking some units from the far eastern part of the Russian Federation and put them in Ukraine in order to get an effective fighting force on the scale that they've been using. There are other analysts who are quite clear that although Putin talks a good game on the military, his military still faces very significant structural problems and is nowhere near as good. And in fact, Baltic states intelligence believes that when last summer the Russians were kind of exercising 40,000 troops on the border of Ukraine, kind of implying that they might move in, that the Russians wouldn't do that because those 40,000 troops were the absolute best troops in the Russian military, and that if they'd gone in there and had then faced some upsurge of violence in Chechnya or somewhere else, they would not have had the capability to deal with both scenarios at the same time. So we need sober judgment. There's also been some very good work done recently by Stephen Pfeiffer at the Brookings Institute on the Russian nuclear modernization program, which demonstrates that it's far from something to worry about in the sense of it being a huge surge of building extra weapons, better weapons. In fact, Steve paints a very good case that actually what's going on is a kind of rhythmic modernization of the Russian military, which happens on a different timeline to the American military, and that some of what's happening is just part of what you would expect because they have very, very aging nuclear forces, and they they would become totally obsolete if they didn't do some of what they're doing. So this is not to say that Russia is no military threat. It could mount a significant threat to an area like the Baltic states. It could not take on and beat NATO in a military confrontation, far from it. But we need to exercise restraint in the way we describe the threat and the way that we understand it. And also, I think we need to exercise restraint in the way in which we refer to intelligence reports. I don't know if anybody else in this room noticed this, but about 2 months ago, a row broke out between the Supreme Allied Commander of the NATO forces in Europe, General Breedlove, an American general, and German intelligence. Essentially, Breedlove has been going out into the public domain and saying the Russians have put 10,000 troops here, they've been doing this here, they've been doing this here. The German intelligence community came out quite openly and said, we just do not see what you're seeing. You know, what's the intelligence basis for these reports? And quite frankly, I mean, if you talk to a lot of people at NATO, as I have done in recent months, it's quite clear that Breedlove is going out into the public domain and making assertions which are not backed up entirely by the intelligence, and he's doing it deliberately to try and bounce his own president into doing things that President Obama is not willing to do. And he's not the only one doing it. There are lots of people engaging in public diplomacy trying to change the political context of leadership decision making, and it wouldn't surprise me if we were to wake up one day quite soon and find out that Breedlove was no longer in his position, because I would imagine that President Obama knows exactly what's going on and he's getting pretty tired of it. But some people are trying to misuse the intelligence. And for those of you who may have read Peter Hennessy's book, The Secret State, on the history of the British security state during the Cold War, compare that with the role played by the Joint Intelligence Chiefs here during the Cuban Missile Crisis, in which the intelligence reports, even amid huge media hype and concern, told our political leadership not to put our nuclear-capable bombers on alert because they could not see signs of Soviet preparation for war, and if we were to do so, it would be read as preparation for war and would be itself an escalatory measure. So there is an element of restraint that has to be built in here to the way in which we use intelligence, and this debate is a live debate going on inside NATO right now. There are several NATO countries who are trying to ensure that there needs to be some sort of process of agreeing what intelligence actually shows before somebody's authorised to go out and start talking about it publicly, and that would be a very good thing. And so that's the theme of restraint. Resolve and restraint. And then the last of the three themes is dialogue. About 3 months ago, there was a row erupted at the European Union when one of the members of the European Leadership Network, Federica Mogherini, who's now effectively the EU foreign policy chief, had a paper drafted which talked about how the European Union might begin re-engaging with Russia on a whole range of issues. Mogherini was criticised heavily by mostly East European members of the European Union, it has to be said. Donald Tusk, the former Polish Prime Minister, who's obviously now playing a lead role in the European Commission, intervened. Not only did he toughen up the paper...
Sorry, he's President of the Council.
Sorry, President of the Council, not the Commission yet, I apologise. Tusk intervened and made it clear that he disagreed with the paper publicly, made it clear also, told his staff to go out and brief against Mogherini, and told journalists that the paper was only as bad as it was after it had been much improved by Tusk. And this was all in the context of an argument which said we have to wait. There shouldn't be any dialogue. Dialogue is some kind of reward we give to the Russians when they've changed their behaviour. I just fundamentally reject that definition of dialogue. The purpose of dialogue is to try and, first of all, explain to each other why we think what we think. To try and understand that as a first base to engaging in some sort of constructive dialogue, some kind of constructive engagement. What are the areas where we should be talking to the Russians right now? Well, there are quite a few. I mean, first of all, I think we could call, and we should call, the Russian leadership's bluff on the issue of visa-free travel. They've been talking about visa-free travel for years. Right now, as I said earlier, people-to-people contacts between Russia and the West are declining. That's creating a vacuum in which demonised perceptions of the other can be created and sustained. And I think we should just make it clear that actually visa-free travel is a great idea. Let's let the Russian people come to the West and see what it's like here. Let's let the West, people from the West go to Russia and see what it's like there. And let's have a flourishing of civil society engagement, university engagement, higher education engagement, and so on. Because that kind of society-to-society engagement is a way of breaking down the barriers. And some of you will know that the Russian authorities in the last year or so defined many NGOs that were receiving foreign funding of any kind as foreign agents. Well, as one of the ELN members said at an event in Moscow recently, let's have visa-free travel, but just be sure on the Russian side that when you get that, you'll have millions of foreign agents moving around in and out of your country, penetrating the propaganda haze that you've managed to construct, and giving people a different view of how the world really is. We could be talking to them about that. We should be having an arms control conversation with the Russians about how we can recreate some of the mechanisms, some of the conventional arms control mechanisms in Europe, so that nobody needs to fear a short warning conventional attack from the other side. We could, for example, expand and intensify the Open Skies Treaty, which allows reconnaissance flights to take place. There's a whole range of measures, confidence and security building measures one could try and get into. Some people say, well, you need a partner for that and Putin's not interested. But I think we're reaching the point where a powerful argument can be made to the Russian leadership that this is very much in their own national security interests as well as in ours. Ask yourself what would have happened if that civilian airliner that I described earlier had been brought down by that Russian warplane, if the two had collided. It seems to me that a very clear message would have had to go out from Western governments that these flights stop. They stop now, and if they don't stop now, we're going to interdict. Okay? And we're going to interdict much more forcefully than we have been doing now. They would have had to say it, they would have had to say it publicly, because to do anything else, to say to their own citizens, we're not taking firm action to stop this happening again, we're just going to wait for you to tumble out of the sky, would have been politically unacceptable. Having said it publicly, Putin would have been backed into a difficult position where he would have had to publicly back down, change his position, or not. But we could have been in an escalatory cycle with all of that nonsense going on and prestige at stake and all of that. So I think there's a strong case of also saying that to the Russians. What do you think would have happened next? And is that where you want to be, or shall we have a conversation about how we stop that kind of thing happening? During the Cold War, there was an incidents at sea agreement between the Soviet Union and the United States about how to manage incidents of warships coming up close against each other, how to deal with certain eventualities if they happened. Right now we could be talking to the Russians about a similar agreement for close encounters in the air in Europe, and we should be. So we should be talking to them about that. Right now there's also an economic dialogue going on between the European Union, the Ukrainian authorities and the Russian authorities on the issue of how to keep payments for Russian gas into Ukraine flowing and how to implement the Ukrainian association agreement with the European Union. There's been a delay in the implementation of that agreement, specifically to try and take on board Russian concerns about what the impact on the Russian economy might be. So we have two tracks of trilateral economic dialogue ongoing already. Each of those, it seems to me, could be a bridgehead to a wider conversation about economic cooperation. There should be an ongoing conversation between the European Union and the Eurasian Economic Union. Some people say that these two institutions are fundamentally incompatible, but my answer to that is NAFTA and the European Union are fundamentally incompatible, which is why there's a protracted negotiation going on to try and create the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. That's what you do. You sit down and negotiate with people. Most of the countries involved in the Eurasian Economic Union and all of the countries involved in the European Union are members of the WTO. And this is a conversation that could happen. For many years, Putin has talked about the vision of cooperative economic space from Lisbon to Vladivostok. I think that's an agenda we should embrace and try and make real, as I say, using the trilateral dialogue on the Ukrainian economy as a way to get into that debate. So I think there are many areas and issues in which we could be cooperating. I didn't mention Ukraine, but of course in Ukraine we need to find ways of working collectively. There's the Minsk II process which brought about the ceasefire that's currently in train. Nobody knows how long that's going to last or what diplomatic mechanism can be put in place if it fails. But there are specific things that we could try and work on together with the Russians, and some of the Russian participants at our meeting in Riga last week brought some of those ideas to the table. The OSCE monitors in Ukraine, for example, deeply understaffed and badly equipped. So, for example, they don't even have the trained personnel in that mission to be able to track down if an artillery shell has been fired from somewhere and landed somewhere else. They don't have the capability to track where that came from and to identify that. They have no, well, they have 2 functioning drones for the whole of Ukraine. And beyond that, the OSCE has no independent intelligence gathering capability whatsoever. It relies on the United States intelligence community to share whatever intelligence it wants to share. And so if you're looking at that from the Russian point of view, you think, well, of course the OSCE is saying this now because the Americans have just, supplied some intelligence, but it's a one-sided view. So, I mean, there are things like trying to strengthen the functionality of the OSCE in Europe that we could work on with the Russians, where they would see an interest as well as it being in our interests, and we could do things of direct relevance to what's going on the ground in Ukraine. So, for me, this situation is serious. I think a large part of the blame needs to rest with President Putin, although the West has certainly made policy mistakes and has contributed to the situation. If we're going to deal with it and try and get out of it, I think we need this combination of resolve, restraint and dialogue. And I'll stop there.
Fantastic, very good. Right, so I imagine there will be quite a lot of questions. There we go.
About Ukraine, they're taking steps to eventually join NATO. Once they become a member of the NATO, the Russian Black Sea fleet would have to disappear, to be replaced by a NATO Black Sea fleet. So wouldn't that have serious strategic implications?
One of the examples of restraint which I should have given and didn't give is that Ukraine can't join NATO. We can't join NATO. We cannot. Well, Ukraine, it's often said by people in Eastern Europe, including by people in Ukraine, that countries have the right to join the alliances that they choose. It's also the case that alliances have the right to choose the members they have. And there are a number of countries in Europe and a number of peoples in Europe who have got no intention of dying to defend Ukraine. And in that context, NATO membership can't be offered and won't be offered. And it would be wrong to offer it because many countries in NATO would fail to honour it in the breach. So I think what we have to say to the Ukrainian people is we understand your aspiration, but you should not build a serious defence policy and foreign policy on the assumption that you will get into NATO because other NATO countries will not let you in. NATO has made it clear it will not defend you, and that's why everything I said about helping Ukraine defend itself was structured in the way it was said. Ukraine cannot be left defenceless, but it will not get into NATO. And I think there are many people in Ukraine who understand that reality, even though they cling to the rhetoric of trying to get into Ukraine, into NATO one day.
I have a comment actually on that point to add. There's also another aspect, like if there was a new member to be admitted to NATO, then it has to be with a benefit of the security of the whole alliance. So by admitting Ukraine, which is now bound to be tried to be influenced by Putin even further, and even through Crimea, then this is basically allowing NATO to let in a member who will be already actively destabilized by another state. So that would be in a kind of in a shorter term, and in a longer term, that would be detrimental to the security interests of the whole alliance. So unless that situation gets sorted out to the extent that Ukrainian government and democratic institutions are working well, and they can kind of fend off such external influences, then at that time I think that it will be possible to see the prospect of Ukraine joining NATO at some point, if it chooses to do so. So yeah, just
Yes, and it's following up on the same question, but broadening in this sense. You said right at the beginning, and I'm very glad that you did, that amongst the the strategic areas of the West which have partly led to the problem is NATO expansion to the east. And there's surely no doubt that from the Russian point of view, that is seen as an aggressive action. So any further NATO expansion would hardly be conducive to improving dialogue. But building on that point, I mean, classic three-point strategy you put forward, very nicely done. But you made quite a lot about resolve. But I'd ask the question, how is it possible to do the kind of activities you're talking, building up military strength, helping the Ukrainians, without making dialogue harder, without making it more difficult, without driving the Russians yet further into the paranoia because the West is encroaching, because the West is attacking? it's arguable that the whole issue in the Ukraine started with multiple interventions by the West and the Russians on two sides. We don't say who's right and who's wrong, but both sides have been actively destabilising Ukraine for at least 20 years. So if you want dialogue to work, which is surely the only long-term solution, the first question is, how can you be resolute, that's the right word, without risking the dialogue?
Yes. I mean, I think that question goes right to the heart of the matter, really, of who and what you think you're dealing with in the Russian leadership. Because, and I don't claim to be the world's preeminent Russia expert, but I've read an awful lot and I've talked to a lot of Russia experts in the last few years at great length. And I think what we're dealing with is somebody who, if not confronted with a degree of resolve, will see no incentive to negotiate. If you take the status quo position now, for example, or take Chancellor Merkel's position, she has said sanctions and no arms to Ukraine and the diplomatic track, the Minsk II track. And that's fine as far as it goes. But if Minsk II fails, and if nothing is done to help Ukraine defend itself, then President Putin will be able to do what he wants in Ukraine. Everybody else in the eastern neighbourhood of Europe will see exactly what's just gone on. That there's only one actor on the stage here that's willing to do anything militarily, and that's the Russians. Therefore, you get in line and stay in line, otherwise you might be next. And that, I think, despite all the rhetoric about Russia not being allowed to have a sphere of influence in Eastern Europe, will effectively hand President Putin a sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. And that for the next few years, we'll just be observing it. And that there'll be no incentive for him to negotiate. So, for me, the resolve part of the equation is an important part of getting him to the negotiating table. This is where I differ from some people who are a little bit more at the hawkish end of this debate, who seem to think that the objective here is to try and defeat President Putin. I think that would be a disaster. If your frame of reference is to try and defeat him, I think that would be a disaster. And will almost certainly lead to escalation. I think the frame of reference has to be, how do we get this man and his regime to the negotiating table to do some practical deals about what needs to happen in Europe. And that a certain element of resolve is necessary to that. But the restraint element is where I try and deal with this challenge. It's like, I recognise it, how do you not make it much, much harder to have dialogue? And that's where I think you must not do some of the things, brandishing intelligence reports that are exaggerated, talking about stuff in Eastern Europe full of nuclear weapons, etc., etc. These things are exactly the kinds of things we shouldn't do for precisely the reason that you mentioned.
One thing that you haven't really mentioned is the opinion of the people living in some of these countries along the border. I haven't been to Ukraine, I have read about it, but I have been to Estonia and actually some of the places in Central Asia that used to be part of the Soviet Union. And it's quite clear in all those places that the Russian-speaking elements are treated as second-class citizens. They've lost their languages, and there's a kind of go-home attitude in some places. Although home, well, their forebears have been in those areas since the 19th century, so they are from Uzbekistan or wherever. And as I understood it, the same is true in Ukraine, that the eastern side of the country is Russian-speaking, very integrated with the Russian economy, and they want to continue that. So where do they fit into, where do those kind of peoples fit into this equation? Because I don't believe, for instance, that all the Estonians will think the same way. And certainly in Ukraine, they'd elected a Russian, kind of somebody from the Russian-speaking section before the crisis started in its most extreme form. So aspirations of the people.
I would separate out the Baltic states point from the Ukraine point. The Baltic states point, I think, it's certainly true that there are issues inside some of the Baltic states that need to be addressed on the role and position and status of the Russian minorities. Although those problems were much bigger in the early 1990s, and were much more acute in the early 1990s at the time when the Cold War first came to an end. And at that time, Wolf-Ekeus, who's one of the members of the ELN, was the OSCE Commissioner for Minority Rights and spent a lot of his time making sure that those tensions didn't erupt. Since then, the conditions of Russian speakers in the Baltic states have improved enormously. And the interesting thing is, opinion polls conducted amongst the Russian population in the Baltic states are not showing large percentage of, they're showing almost negligible support for the idea that they should become part of Russia. I mean, these are people who are living inside the European Union, using the euro, freely travelling wherever they want, and experiencing a whole different kind of life to what people are experiencing in Russia. That's not to say that they don't have close family ties and so on. So I think there are still issues. I think there are people, as I've referred to, some of the analysis that some of the national security people in the Baltic states have themselves been doing about the economic inequalities. Those issues have to be addressed, but I wouldn't exaggerate them. In Ukraine doesn't break down into a neat kind of here's the Russian bit and here's the Ukrainian bit. If you go to Kiev, almost everybody's speaking Russian all the time. I mean, there are more people speaking Russian than you do speaking Ukrainian, even in the context of what's happened. And so I think the picture is just much more complicated than that. It's a real mixture. Nevertheless, I do believe that that there were genuine political, economic, and security problems in that region of Ukraine. Perhaps not as many as President Putin was hoping, because I think he was hoping to take a bigger chunk. I think he was thinking that he could make more people go out on the streets and demonstrate for the separatist cause than actually happened. But it was a corrupt state. It had corrupt police forces. It had in some cases, very limited loyalty to the central government in Kiev, but actually more loyalty to local oligarchs. And you saw all of that. It was no coincidence, I think, that 80% of the police force in a place like Donetsk effectively resigned and, went to the other side and refused to take its orders from the government in Kiev. So there's some very significant fissures inside the state, and it was corrupt. And it's certainly the case that there were lots of people who were willing to believe that what had just happened in Kiev was an unconstitutional coup driven by a bunch of extremist right-wingers backed by the United States, and that they were likely to be the subject of some persecution as a result. So I think there are very significant political challenges that have to be met there and responded to there. But I think that's quite a different situation to the one in the Baltic states.
Fred and then Cal.
Now, I think your presentation at the military and technical and current political analysis is excellent, but I think that you've ignored to a very large degree the historical dimension. And when I say historical, I mean, from 50 to several hundred years ago. And if you listen to things like Russian television, I mean, obviously it's propaganda, but a lot of times people believe their own propaganda. So there's the whole business of the protection of Russia, going back to the Russian Revolution. There's the Kievian state going back 1,000 years, the ties of orthodoxy. And these are things that figure very large, in the Russian propaganda and indeed in counter-propaganda. But I think that these are things that are not just propaganda. I think they're felt very strongly and actually have rather strong influences in decision-making. And I'm really concerned that people are so tied up with the present and forget history so much that they ignore this very large dimension, this nationalistic dimension. People still believe that they're fighting World War II against the fascists or World War I. And I think that these are very real things to a lot of people, and I think they're largely ignored in looking for solutions.
I think that's a fair point, although one of my own motivations for being against NATO enlargement was, although not specifically in the Ukrainian context here, one of my motivations for opposing NATO enlargement has been that my reading of the history of that region is that it's still deeply, deeply scarred territory, and that what we were doing was enlarging an alliance onto a territory with that fissure, multiple fissures, embedded in its societies, and that we didn't know what we were doing, frankly, for that reason. And we didn't understand also that we were importing certain views on some of those fissures into the inside of the alliance, which was going to change the internal dynamics of the alliance quite markedly in ways that we didn't understand either. So I think for historical reasons we were very short-sighted and misguided. But I also would have to say that some of what you're describing I recognise as the Russian picture. And this is, this is bubbling away right now in terms of the real day-to-day thinking that's going on about which of our political leaders should or should not attend the World War II memorials, in Moscow in a few weeks' time. Because of, if one's to go there, are you buying into a certain narrative of the kind that you're partly describing? I think these are important issues, but the Russian state is mobilising propaganda and it's mobilising these stories on its own side of the equation quite strongly. I don't believe, and they lurch between this kind of fascist onslaught, replay of World War II stuff, to trying to stress the kind of common, Orthodox brotherhood and, our close, brothers in Ukraine and so on. I mean, partly my answer to this is, you also have to talk to Ukrainians who don't actually buy into any of this stuff and who think, and understand quite clearly that what happened on the Maidan was not a fascist Western backed coup, but a kind of civil society uprising because it was watching its country being handed over to President Putin's control in their eyes. And that they've launched a revolutionary process. There's since been democratic elections, there's a democratic government, and that they just don't buy any of that narrative. As far as they're concerned, and I was talking to some about it last week, and if you excuse my language, I'll basically just say we've had enough of all that crap, okay? This is Europe in the 21st century. This is the future we want, and we're entitled to have it. That's the message they deliver. So I accept what you're saying on the Russian side. I think there's lots of people in Ukraine who actually are not bogged down in that stuff, and who are just saying we just want, a different future.
To an extent, you've already picked up on what I was going to ask, because I was going to ask, you've talked very much about Putin, not so much about the thinking of the regime, of the sort of political intellectuals in Russia. And I wondered, when you talk about dialogue, how much mileage is there in talking outside of Putin's immediate regime, or is it solidly behind him?
Well, you've seen the same opinion polls I have, I guess, which has shown his soaring popularity since the annexation of Crimea. There are a few liberal voices in Moscow, but they're isolated. If the economy tanks quite badly over the next 2 to 3 years, it's possible that the level of discontent with Putin will grow, and we might see large demonstrations in Moscow again, but probably not on a sufficient scale to change the direction of the country, because it's still quite a small number of middle-class people in the major metropolitan centres that you're talking about. And if you engage with the Russian intellectual elite, certainly on foreign defence security policy, then they don't agree with everything that President Putin says or does, but they're a long, long way from where most of the Western intellectual and policy community is, and they're much closer to President Putin's position than they are to the position of some of his liberal critics. Which is why I say, it's a very dangerous assumption to believe that after Putin, something more friendly to the West comes, because I don't necessarily think that's true. And there's no evidence that the intelligentsia in Russia is actively mobilised against Putin. I mean, I think there are economists who are sort of saying, look, this can only go so far, and then we're going to run out of reserves, and there's going to be a sort of crisis point. And there are some economists who will say there's nobody around Putin who really understands the economics properly, and that's why he's making such bad decisions. And there are some who say, we can see that in the long term this is a very negative set of developments for our country. But really, honestly, in terms of this narrative about the West, about what the West has done, about the threats to Russian security, about the way in which Russia has been treated with disrespect, and needs to defend itself and defend its interests, and that it has a legitimate right to do so, all of that is deeply embedded, deeply embedded.
Can I just pick up that point? I was in Moscow just about a year ago, shortly after Maidan. And this was a Pugwash organised meeting, and so naturally it was a very selected audience, but they were almost overwhelmingly against the point of view which had just been expressed in a public speech by the foreign minister, which was fully in support of Putin, and said they had either been themselves in Maidan or they had close friends who had, and what the media was saying about what that uprising was complete nonsense. And then reading some of your publications, particularly Igor Ivanov, who's a thoroughly reasonable Russian who happens to have had significant political clout not so many years ago, but who again is taking a much more liberal stance than Putin. Is the Russian minority who sees it more objectively really such a small minority?
Well, my view of it is that it is quite small. I mean, it depends on which issue you're talking about, but something like Fyodor Lukyanov, the editor of Russia and Global Affairs, at the Munich Security Conference and a side event we had there, I mean, he got gasps from some participants from Ukraine, because he said there were over 20,000 Ukrainian troops sent into Crimea to put down, the Crimean sort of separatists to retake the parliament, etc., and that the Russian troops were in there to defend it. Now, he's a thoroughly sensible, individual who, but he was saying what he believed. He's not the sort of individual who spouts just a party line for the sake of it. He's saying what he believed, and there were lots of other Russians in the room who were nodding, and it was one of those moments where there was just a total, parallel monologue. The people from the Russian side of the argument were just operating on the basis of a totally different reality to other people in the room. And I think that runs quite widespread and quite deep.
Yes, sir.
There's an article in The Guardian by Simon Jenkins today in which he argues that sanctions never work, and they always make things worse because the present sanctions will just stiffen anti-Western feelings in Russia. Is he right? Or, I mean, you obviously think he isn't right because you said we should have sanctions. But is he really wrong? I mean, can one give examples of cases or can you give a single example of a case where sanctions have really made things better?
Well, I agree with his overall thesis in general terms, which is why I was saying that I thought sanctions were being asked to take a policy strain that they weren't really well suited to bear. But I suppose the debate is on right now about what's brought the Iranians to the table. Yeah. But even if it was sanctions, it's taken 7 years, minimum, maybe 10 years.
Discussed that and said no, that wasn't.
Well, then that's fine. But then he's got Simon. I mean, with all due respect to Simon Jenkins, I'm not sure what his grip on the internal dynamics of the Iranian regime is. I'm not sure that he can just dismiss, the implication of sanctions. Although I have to say that his general point is correct. I mean, sanctions primarily are a message to. They very rarely succeed in achieving their primary policy objective. They have secondary motivations, and they are quite useful at that. Those secondary motivations are to demonstrate to your own side that you're doing something about a situation which is seen as bad, and they're a way of demonstrating displeasure in some way to the other side. So in that sense, sanctions play this political role. But in terms of achieving their primary policy influence, they have a very poor track record. They haven't, worked in North Korea. It's debatable that, maybe they've worked in Iran, but I think what you can say is they don't work quickly, if they work at all. So if one imagines that, you just introduce these sanctions in the way that they've been introduced, and then you sit back and wait for kind of Putin to cry help and then come running back to the West, I think that's wrong for a lot of reasons. One, sanctions don't really work that way. Two, he's much more, before he comes running back to us, he'll do many more deals with the Chinese. And he won't actually succeed in his goal of a strategic partnership with the Chinese because they differ on too much and they're not equal by a long way. But we'll end up effectively with Russia in China's pocket and China playing a big role in Euro-Atlantic security affairs because that's the only place for the Russian leadership to go if they don't come back to the West. So I don't think sanctions will have the effect we want them to have in this case.
Yes, sir.
Your analysis of resolve and restraint leading to dialogue is very convincing. And you have some really interesting things to say about what we, the West, can do outwards towards Russia. But I wonder if there's a major one you've missed, that there's an awful lot going on inside, us speaking to ourselves, that is absolutely antithesis of what you're saying of restraint and leading to dialogue. And the case in point is in the States, the way the opposition to the present government, the Republicans, are absolutely rabidly into really strong resolve, absolutely no restraint whatsoever, and dialogue is only for, you know, weaklings and idiots like Obama and so on. And I would have thought that, as well as doing actually really difficult things towards the hostile forces of the East, a hell of a lot can be done about sorting out what happens inside the West. And President Obama to really turn to those Republicans and address them with the sort of strategy you've got there would go a long way to sorting that and making it very clear to the Russians that we're not standing in for nonsense. Because we stop generating our own nonsense.
One of the reasons why I've constructed the argument I put here in the way that I've constructed is to try and manage that wing of our own debate. I mean, if I spend, you know, even over 3 years ago, 2.5 years ago, when I was talking about engaging in cooperative activities with Russians, lots of people would say, "Oh, well, good luck with that," and we would say we need to have a live arms control conversation ongoing with the Russians because the situation, you know, is deteriorating. We couldn't get anybody's attention for that kind of thing, you know. So. And part of that was that people were trying to position us as some sort of doves that we didn't really understand. For example, in the Baltic states, you know, we would often get the brush off that, you know, people don't really understand the nature of the regime we're dealing with here, you don't understand the challenges. And of course, now they're a little bit in "we told you so" mode.
Yes.
And so I've constructed the argument I presented here to try and manage that wing of the debate, whilst also trying to find a way to get us, well, first of all, you know, keep us from doing stupid things, which, you know, will just make the whole situation worse, and then through that try and get a way back to a more front foot dialogue. I agree with I think the implicit assumption in your statement that some of the most dangerous people on the planet, some of the people in the US Congress, particularly some on the right wing of the Republican Party, and it's always striking and quite a motivating force for me actually when I see the extent to which. And I'm being crude with my language, but the nutters on the right wing in the United States get along just fine with the hardliners in Moscow. And how they need each other and reinforce each other in order to win their own domestic political battles. And in some ways that's why we created the European Leadership Network, to have Russians in it. You know, the Europe we operate by is not the Europe of the EU or NATO. I have Russian board members. I have Russian people, Russian leaders on this task force that I was talking about at the beginning. And we do that deliberately because we want this to be a transnational organisation that's about bringing together more moderate voices and to demonstrate that there are people across this divide who are interested in working with each other and having a different future. So I recognise what you're saying, but I would just say that I think we have thought about it and it's factored in.
You're doing it subtly.
Yes.
I don't believe that I'm as deeply involved in these issues. I'm more of an amateur in these matters, and so I put some thoughts tentatively to you. Perhaps you can connect them. I'm surprised at the presentation, and I recognise a great deal of the detail from my own reading and observation, but nevertheless, you present a picture of the West as white and of Russia as black, whereas I think there's a danger that because Putin is obviously a fearsome character and it's been apparent for many years. Nevertheless, there are some things that he may well be correct in his own perception of events. And so, for example, they are arguing now, why was NATO kept after the Cold War? It was constructed to confront the communist regime. It should not now be enforced. There's no justification. You haven't mentioned the Caucasus and Georgia and the events of what, 5, 6, 7 years ago, which at the time I understood Putin's fear, or it may well be that he was looking for cracks in the facade because he was an opportunist. But it was very clear that the way in which the USA was subverting everywhere and forming local alliances looked like a pincer movement around the Caucasus and around the boundaries of the sphere of influence of the USA, of the West. So I saw some substance in the reasons for his action, and I saw parallels now in the Ukraine, and the tendency to disregard the subtleties of subdivision, which this gentleman mentioned much more expertly, which ignores or disregards the cultural substrata, which he said goes back only a couple of centuries, but others have said even further. And it seemed to me as an amateur historian that the great divide was between the Habsburg Empire and the Russian Empire on the east, and that this still reverberates in the religious practices, the senses of affiliation and of loyalty, as well as of language, between left and right, west and east. And there's another aspect which you haven't mentioned at all. In your presentation of the Western stance as being pretty pure and white, it disregards also the, I mean, you present the West as being almost a homogeneous force of self-righteous democrats, whereas in fact there are huge underlayers of criticism and resentment of the way in which Western democracy, we believe, or they believe, have been subverted by neoliberalism and by a global oligarchy who in fact occupy the Western powers. And I think that Putin has seen this and is using that as a kind of legitimate lever to interfere and intrude himself as a man who otherwise feels disempowered and humiliated by the loss of power. So, and I think that there's a lot of support for that view in the West, which is in fact sublimated by the control of the press in the West, including the BBC, what they don't report, and the emphasis which is selective, so as to support this black and white view. So I actually see the need for looking at multicultural subdivision of territories and nations with more local power divisions as being the antidote to the giantism which is forcing these conflicts so dangerously. And then just lastly, amongst greatly more important people than myself who've been saying, putting forward views echoing what I've put in expertly, are, I believe, Gorbachev and Kissinger.
Well, there's a lot in there. You stitched that together as an amateur, then congratulations. But I don't accept your characterisation that I put forward, the West was white and the West was black. I started out my talk by saying that we shouldn't have enlarged NATO. The West of the European Union strategy for the Eastern neighbourhood was had an element of sleepwalking to disaster about it. You know, so I've been fairly critical about that. I also think you could have actually added something else to your case, which is that, you know, President Putin has delivered a number of speeches now in which he has effectively said to the West, I do not recognise your interpretation of national sovereignty or your right to intervene in the affairs of other states. I do not recognise your authority to define when you know, some secessionist movements should be allowed to secede and be recognised as independent states and others shouldn't. He's been heavily criticised in the West for saying that his argument is that there's either going to be new rules that he'll be at the table for, or there'll be no rules. No rules. Actually, that's not his message at all. What his message has been to the West is, there are no rules. You people keep talking about rules, but you don't behave as though there are any rules. You ignore the rules whenever you want to ignore the rules, and I strongly believe that line of argument. In fact, one of the strands of activity that we just got a new grant to pursue is a couple of big narrative conferences with the Russians to exactly get into that territory, because he has developed a different narrative on international law, a different narrative on the right to intervene in the affairs of other states and sovereignty, and a different narrative on territorial integrity and the right to secede. And it's a real and genuine argument and debate we should be having with the Russian side, and we're not having it, we're ignoring it. And last week in Riga, when I said to colleagues from the Baltic states, I made this point, and I challenged them, you know, is he wrong? There was just a kind of embarrassed silence. And I've noticed that 5 or 6 times in Western policy-making circles, you make this point and say we should be having this debate with the Russians on these issues. People just kind of gloss over it, and then they move back to the debate they're more comfortable with. Well, I agree with you, that's not good enough. Western behaviour hasn't been all white. I also agree with you that one shouldn't conceive of the West, and I don't personally conceive of the West as a kind of homogeneous whole. I'm just using that as a shorthand for purposes of this talk, because, frankly, when you dig into what the West is, and I'm not sure what it is anymore, but, does it include Cyprus, which just offered a military base to the Russians? Does it include Greece? Does
All
it
this needs sorting.
Exactly, so one goes on.
Future will bring us to the point where we have to.
However, I want to make two other points. One is, all of the cultural points you talked about, fine, I'm willing to accept them. I mean, we can draw, there's no good place to draw a line on a map almost anywhere in Europe where you don't cut through some sort of social, cultural...
We shouldn't be doing it at all.
No, maybe not, but the point is, we kind of developed a mechanism for acknowledging that we lived in that environment, and that mechanism was the Helsinki Principles. That we've got all these issues, the OSCE had national minority rights, commissioners.
I'm sorry, LSE?
The OSCE, the Organisation for
sorry.
Security and Cooperation in Europe, had national minority rights commissioners. We developed the principles of no change of borders by military force, etc. What's different about what President Putin has done is he has changed the borders of Europe using force. He's basically said, and he's not only done that, but he's implied in exactly the same way that Hitler did in the 1930s, that if there are Russians living in other states that say, then they are part of Russia, and it's the job of the Russian government in Moscow to
Because he feels
protect them.
outsmarted by the USA.
Well, all I'm simply saying is that there's an element of his activity which is not acceptable. And I say that as somebody who opposed the invasion of Iraq and took part in the demonstrations against the invasion of Iraq, and who's now saying we should be having this debate with the Russians on what the rules of the road should be. But I still think there's a whole element of his activity which needs to be challenged, and I think on the cultural side of things, I think two things together. He's now saying that the way you resolve these issues is you deploy your military.
As a last resort.
It's not acceptable. It's not acceptable in Europe in the 21st century. We either accept that or we don't.
It's clear that this discussion could go on a long time. Fortunately, we only have to walk across the corridor where drinks are being served. We can then continue the discussion to the extent people like. But I think I would like to draw a pause to the discussion now and give a huge thank you to you, not only for a very interesting talk, but a very stimulating way to respond to lots of comments. So, thank you very much.